This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
A quick public service announcement. A free e-course from me. Easily found. trendfollowing.com/e-course. That's the letter E, the word course. trendfollowing.com/e-course. This is one of my best ways to jump into the trend following world right now. Go check it out. My guest today is David Burkus. This is David's second appearance on the show. Today we discuss his newest book, Friend of a Friend, Understanding the Hidden Networks that Can Transform Your Life and Your Career. And he posits the simple question, what if the advice we've heard all about networking was wrong? I know one thing, my networking path, completely non-traditional, and I'm happy to see that many of the things that I've learned along the way, David has codified. He has put into words that memorialize many of the instincts that I've had. Look, I'm not saying that I'm perfect or all that or anything like that, but David's done a really great job of outlining networking for the modern age. This really is that new look at the art and science of networking. How do you meet people? How do you meet the right people? Once you have the network, what do you do with it? A strong network? A weak network? Have you even thought about how this all fits together to your best use for your life? This is one of those conversations that's for all of us. Because if you're not networking, if you're not meeting people, those people that you never expected to meet, you're going to have an average, boring life. That much I can promise. Without further delay, let's jump right in with my conversation with David Burkus. You know, David, I love doing this podcast because invariably, something will happen before each episode where I go, gosh, I did not think of that. And it's always this self-reflection thing. And so here today, you force me to think about my network. To the outside world, it might look like I have an interesting network, 600 podcast plus episodes, different people that I know. But I don't know if I've been as strategic as I could have been about these things over the years so far. But your work has really forced me to kind of like take a step back and think about, gosh, how did that happen? How did that evolve? What does it mean? What can I do better with it? It's the fun of doing this show is everybody that comes on usually is bringing something where I personally just go, aha. As we tear this apart, I think it would be fun even to talk about is that, and I don't want to name any names, but our connection is through a friend of a friend.
I know. It's funny. As we're recording this, the book is not even out yet, and I already have friends of mine making jokes about like looking at me and smiling like it's a bad pun. And I'm thinking, man, I'm never going to live that particular element down. But no, you're exactly right. And actually, first of all, I didn't realize it was 600 episodes. That's amazing. Congrats to you. I think the average person does like 6 and then quits podcasting. So that's awesome. But as I'm sure that you've noticed, like it's actually a really valuable tool for building the network in a way that's true to some of what you probably read in Friend of a Friend. I think most people, when they think about their network, they think about like the contacts app on their phone, or they think about their direct LinkedIn connections. And that's not the point. In the subtitle, we use this term hidden network. That applies to the people that you've probably forgotten about because you don't know enough to have their cell phone number programmed into your phone. Or like you and I, the people who are 1 or 2 degrees of separation out, but are really easy connections to make. The people that you're aware of what I'm doing, I'm aware of what you're doing, even if we're only talking every couple of years because we've got multiple friend-to-friend connections to each other. And there's a huge amount of opportunity in that part of the network as well. I mean, I'm glad I jogged your mind. I think that's really the big kind of message is that when we think about our network, we need to be thinking about those things, not just who's on our phone.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a moment because, I'm going to be frank, I don't really use LinkedIn. I mean, I use it in that I have thousands of contacts and I'll log in maybe once a month and there'll be, 50 or 100 or whatever requests to become a LinkedIn friend. And I will just usually sit there and go through them all and I'll accept 95%. I don't use it. And I'm something similar to Facebook. And of course, Twitter, you don't really have to worry about it. People just follow you. But what does this really mean? What does this really mean, right? I've done 600 podcast episodes, but let's say 300 or 400 interviews. To me, that's a real relationship. Now, when you and I finish our conversation, 2 years from now, we might not necessarily remember the exact content, but we've established something. And when we get back on the phone together or the call or whatever, we're going to immediately kind of have a rapport again, and it comes flooding back into our minds. Oh yes, we've been there before. We have a familiarity. That's not really true in these things like Facebook and LinkedIn. If you don't really know the person, how useful is that for your network if you don't really know anything about them?
No, I actually agree with you. So when I was writing the book, my editor and I had a series of duels about, well, you can't write a book about networking and not mention LinkedIn. And I was like, well, actually, yes, you can, and I'm going to do it. And then he kept saying, you got to give something. So if you notice at the end of every chapter, there's like a one paragraph. Okay, this is what this means online. And the reason is that ultimately an online social network is useless if it's not mirroring your in-person network. So like you said, those connections that like they follow you, you might follow them because you accepted a friend request from them 6 years ago. Those aren't representative of what's happening in real life. And so they're not all that effective. Now, I will say one thing I'm really encouraged by, and it used to be LinkedIn's strong suit, and I think they've kind of let Facebook come out from behind and take the lead on this, is I'm actually really a big fan of groups. In other words, the Facebook groups, or it used to be LinkedIn groups, but now they're harder to find in the service. They are a wonderful opportunity to engage in what I call in the book a silo or a shared activity. They're groups that are formed around either a specific purpose in mind or a specific sort of shared love of something like a sport or a hobby, etc. And they're a wonderful opportunity to make that introductory connection on something deeper than just that you accepted a request from them, on something like a shared activity, a shared love that allows a relationship to build a little bit deeper first. And then if you become an actual, in-person connection, it's a stronger relationship faster. So there is some opportunity there, but ultimately I think most people need to be thinking about these tools as an online representation of their real world network. Otherwise, you're going to find they're not as effective as, like you said, getting on the phone with somebody is. You could do it once every 2 years and still have a tighter connection than if you see each other's status updates.
I think we've been seduced a little bit by the idea of just, quote, add a friend, and then you've really added a friend. Not really. Hey, let's take this big picture for a moment before we dive deeper. Human networks following the same principles as computer networks, a big picture point in your work. Why don't you first tackle, from your perspective for the audience's education, something basic, a computer network, and connect that into the idea of human networks and following the same principles. Why don't you let people into your thinking there?
The interesting thing is it's not just computer networks, it's almost all networks. Networks of in ecology, food chain networks, right? Networks of how individual animals interact with each other, humans, computer networks, etc. Anytime you have this sort of nodes and connections approach, you start to find really similar principles. And so, and then this is kind of the thesis of the book. There's a lot of advice books on networking. There's ones that give you all sorts of tools and helpful tips on how to practice your elevator pitch. There's a book that can promise you how to win friends and influence people. It's a good book. I mean, there's all sorts of advice. Never Eat Alone, another great book, but it's advice. And advice is one person, and interestingly enough, usually one male, one person's advice on how they built their network. And that's great if you're the same person in the same situation with the same background, maybe even in the same city as the person giving advice. But if your biography doesn't look a lot like theirs, that advice isn't exactly all that useful. And so what I wanted to do was find where is there evidence-based, scientifically proven tools or advice on how to analyze one's network. It turns out that for as long as there's been an internet, and actually a little bit before that, for as long as people have been having to think about networks as utility, the way you have to think of when you're designing internet connections, et cetera, there's been a lot of study of networks as an independent thing. The field of network science is about 40, 50 years old. Some say longer than that, but it was sort of a subdomain of math before that. And we've learned a few things that almost all networks have in common. And they're things that some of us know in human networks, where we say, like, we meet a friend of a friend, and we're way off in Italy vacationing, and suddenly we find that we have the same friend in common with this other person that we met. And then we go, oh, it's such a small world, right? Well, this is a real phenomenon in almost all networks, computer or not. In fact, in the case of computer networks, the fact that it's so interconnected, the fact that there's usually only one or two links from any server to any other server, is what makes it so resilient. It's almost impossible to shut down the internet these days because of that connectivity. And the same thing appears in real world human networks. And this is really good news, right? I mean, one of the other pieces of advice in so many of these networking books is, or you'll hear people throw up their hands and go, you know what? I feel like it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, that's actually really good news if you can understand how networks work and study them, and then know how to know all of the people that you need to know.
The who you know part, I mean, my gosh, I look at my situation, I start in the trading space. And then I add a few network nodes, one that I can still think of as being really critical, and I think it was in 2014, having the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, come on this show. That network node alone was like, boom. That one node essentially put this podcast from only being to talking to, let's say, traders, to where today I'm having a conversation with you. And it all started by kind of deviating and going down this side path. There was a few nodes that led to Kahneman, but it was all, but there was a jumping off point, but there's that, I don't think that kind of thinking for most people is where they really wake up and say, you know what, let's figure out ways we can bring another node in that will take us to this path and that path. And it becomes too complex. But the reality is it's terribly important.
Oh, terribly important, and actually fairly simple, right? If you have the right kind of mental model. And that's why, the goal of the book is to get people not to think about their network as just a collection of contacts that they have, the collection of connections on LinkedIn, but to think about the whole network and learn from these principles of network science to understand it, right? So, what you're describing a lot of times is also the phenomenon that makes it feel like it's such a big gap that you cross so easily. Is we know that in networks, people tend to cluster. They cluster around geographies and shared activities and those sort of things. And over time, it's not this perfect matrix where everybody is equally distant from everybody else. You actually get close to some people, far away from other people, and they're developed these things that are referred to as structural holes, right? And a structural hole is that gap between two clusters that needs to be linked. And people like Daniel Kahneman, who's an economist or who worked in economics, but is also trained as a psychologist, and then later, as he gets into thinking fast and slow, we have him almost in that general sort of Gladwellian-esque personal development and science-based books. He's spanning a lot of different structural holes, and so you sort of see that one connection can really be a bridge to a whole different world for you. And this is what I think a lot of people, especially if you're looking to branch out, like you said, beyond trading, what a lot of people either have happened to them without them realizing it because they didn't know it, or just don't even try because it seems like it's too big of a gap. But you just need to find that one person that can bridge the structural hole for you, and suddenly you're connected to a whole new community of people, a whole new cluster. And you keep doing that, it keeps compounding, and then you find you end up in the situation that you're in, Michael, where you're sitting back 600 interviews later, 600 new connections and connections to potential new clusters, and you're going, wow, I have this really broad network that that I didn't even realize, or that maybe I'm even not utilizing the way. It's something that, again, when you take the rules of network science and you start to examine your own network, you suddenly realize what you need to do and what you've been doing well all along.
Not to toot my own horn or anything like that. I just find this personal reflection, self-observation, analyze myself stuff fun. But there's a real important issue in your work that you cover in your new book, dormancy, things that lie dormant. As I give you this example with Daniel Kahneman, the only way that happened was because I had interviewed another Nobel Prize winner for a documentary film in 2007. His name was Vernon Smith. He happened to have shared the Nobel Prize with Daniel Kahneman. So in 2013, I think it was trying to reach Kahneman. I couldn't. So I figured, you know what? I've interviewed Vernon Smith before, for a documentary. He'll surely come on my podcast. I reached out to Vernon. He came onto the podcast. I then went back because I've been trying to get Kahneman. I went back to Kahneman and I said, hey, I've just interviewed Vernon Smith. He writes me back almost immediately. He goes, hey, I listened to your interview with Vernon Smith. Sure, I'll come on your podcast. So it was literally almost 6 to 7 years of me having to go back in the mental archives to think, how can I connect these dots to get me to where I want to go? And then once I got to Kahneman, as you point out, then that opened up a whole other avenue, but I still had to get to Kahneman.
Yeah, no, exactly. When you say dormancy, what you're referring to is a phenomenon that I find absolutely fascinating. Many people might be familiar with, there's a paper from decades ago called The Strength of Weak Ties. And it's this idea, and anyone who's ever hunted for a job has no doubt had this advice given to them, that it's not your close friends, but your weak ties, those people you're only loosely affiliated with. Oh, I see them at the gym every couple of days because we work out around the same time, or, we go to church together, whatever it is, but we don't really know each other. Those sort of weak ties tend to provide more opportunities than your close friends because you're usually aware of all of the same stuff as your close friends, right? So it's people who are a bit further away from you that see a different perspective. The real benefit, the amazing benefit to me, are these dormant ties. But now, by definition, a dormant tie is a different thing than a weak tie. So a dormant tie is a close friend or somebody that you've had a relationship with, somebody you've sat and interviewed for a documentary, somebody that you've created something with. Those dormant ties are almost better than even weak ties because they're dormant. You haven't talked to them in a while. They're off in their own world, interacting in that cluster, and then you're over in yours. But because there was something tighter there was a relationship there that was bigger than just like a weak tie, it just fell by the wayside. It's easier to build back rapport. This is actually a bit like what you and I were saying, where we could go a year and a half, 2 years, and then connect together for a phone call, and it's like
a dormant tie.
Right, that's a dormant tie, right? And those are far more effective than even weak ties because they provide that same connection, that same ability to bridge a structural hole, everything we've been talking about. But it's easier to get back to that rapport level because they're not strangers, they're not weak ties, they're your friends. You just haven't talked to them in a while.
I'm kind of going mental mind meld here and jumping around on you. Why don't you use a good example for weak ties? Why don't you run with your UFC example and how that all came together?
Yeah, so this is, I think, an amazing story. It's one of my favorites in the book, and it's the story of Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta, who, if you follow the UFC, you know that they were two of the three former owners, along with Lorenzo's brother Frank Jr. of the UFC. They recently sold it about a year and a half, 2 years ago, for $4 billion, which is amazing if you think about it, and because it was. Right before they bought it, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. Now Dana and Lorenzo have an interesting connection to each other. They're a weak tie or a dormant tie. Really, a dormant tie is probably the better term. They went to high school together. They're not exactly sort of super tight friends, but they knew each other. They were in the same social circles, etc. And then Dana got kicked out of that high school. And in the end, actually, Dana moved halfway across the country. His parents kind of kicked him back to New England, where their family was from. He lived with his grandmother for a time, finished high school, never really went to college after that, just kind of floated around. Eventually, he found himself back in Vegas. He owned a gym. He was doing some boxing training. And interestingly enough, he was managing a couple early UFC fighters. If you followed the UFC for a really long time, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz were two of the really big stars. There's actually a very savvy reason that they became stars of the early UFC, and that's because they were the two fighters that Dana was managing when he, at a high school friend's wedding, reconnected with Lorenzo. I couldn't get details on this, but I sort of picture it like you're going through the buffet and you look up and there's your friend you haven't seen in 15 years from high school, Lorenzo Fertitta, right? And they begin to catch up. They have a really great time reconnecting at that wedding because they find that they're both involved in the prize fighting game. Lorenzo is working on the boxing side. I mean, he's the heir to a casino fortune, so he's hosting events, but he also served on the athletic commission that regulated boxing in Nevada, and Dana's managing these fighters. And so they reconnect. And then, like a lot of us do when those sort of serendipitous reconnections happen, they go their separate ways. Maybe they even said, we should do this again sometime soon. But unlike a lot of times when we do that, they actually did. A couple weeks later, through managing Tito and Chuck, Dana finds out that the original owners of the UFC are losing money and looking to kind of sell the franchise, looking to just kind of get back whatever money they can. So he calls up Lorenzo and he goes, I think the UFC is for sale and I think you should buy it. And so they buy it. They buy all the rights to it. The Fertittas, so Lorenzo and his brother Frank, buy it for about $2 million. They pour about another $40 million over the next couple of years to really sort of turn it around. And then it becomes, because of the connection, that Dana knows how to speak fighter, right? He's managing fighters. He knows how to court good fighters. And Lorenzo knows how to speak athletic commission and regulation and all of that sort of thing. And he knows how to find hosts for events and things like that. That combination is really what propels the UFC to, I mean, for the last 20 years has been the fastest growing sports franchise in the world. And it really never would have happened if you didn't have that high school friend's wedding, but it also never would have happened if they weren't off in their own worlds in two very different branches of the prize fighting community. And then once that connection, that weak tie connection was made, suddenly it unlocks tremendous potential for value.
From a chance meeting.
Total chance. I mean, had Dana not decided, like, I mean, think about it. You got kicked out of that high school. It's very easy to just blow the whole thing off and go, you know what, this is a great invitation, but I don't really need to go meet all of these people that graduated and I got kicked out. Right. But he decides to go, and then he, by chance, runs into his old friend Lorenzo. You
know, it's funny about the chance meeting thing, and you actually cited the title of a book, which I don't think I've read, but the Never Eat Alone book. And I have to say, I don't know the content of the book, and I'm sure it's wider than just the title, maybe not. But Never Eat Alone, my gosh, I can't think of how many chance encounters and unique situations that have happened to me because I was particularly alone. There's something about being alone that opens doors. And if you're with a group and it looks like you're busy or this or that, it might not even open, but there's something interesting happens when you're alone and you're open. I mean, I could, again, I don't know what the content of that book was, but it strikes me that sometimes we want all of this hoopla and surroundings around us and all this stuff, but sometimes it's just us.
I'll actually reconcile. You two are not too far apart. You're totally right that when it's just us, and in particular when we alone go make ourselves vulnerable enough to go enter into a new community, right? Rather than drag 3 or 4 friends with us who we'd end up spending all of our time with if we went to that thing, we show up to it alone. There's sort of huge potential for value there. Now, Keith Ferrazzi's point, and Keith, I won't call him a friend, but we've interacted with each other a few times. The last time I saw him was about a year ago at the TED conference. But the premise of his is that meals are opportunities for connections. And there's actually, I mean, there's a part of it. I mean, he's never, ever eat alone. So even if you're doing lunch at your own office, right, find somebody that you could go and connect with. I don't go that far, but one thing that I do, I find one of the reasons, similar to your situation, although I haven't done anywhere near 600 podcasts, I find that a lot of what I've been doing over the last 8 years to grow and better my own network has been influenced by these principles of network science. I knew some of them, right? And one of them was this dormant ties thing. So I live in a part of the world where you probably shouldn't have as robust a network as I have. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I used to make a joke about Tulsa's population making the top 50 most populated cities in America possible, but we recently moved up to number 48. So, we're in the top 50, but we're nowhere near top 10. And it's in the middle of the United States. So if I want to go to a populated area, it's probably 2 to 3.5 hours flight away. When I do that, because I travel a lot for speaking and for other things, one of the things I make sure to do is to reach back out to dormant ties that I know that are in that city and attempt to do, usually it is a meal, but attempt some reconnection. Now I'm there because of speaking or because of a business meeting or something like that, but I'm always trying to sort of make that reconnection. To your point, I do it alone because I'm traveling alone. It's not a big group of people, but the whole point is I'm going to try and reconnect with some of these dormant ties, people that I knew, people that I've met a couple years ago and haven't talked to in a while, and let's use this as an opportunity to reconnect as well. So yeah, when you open yourself up to that idea of I'm going to be outside my comfort zone and not drag 2 or 3 people with me, I'm going to go alone. But also when you use these things as opportunities to reconnect with people or deeper connect with some weak ties, there's a lot of value that's not extracted, but a lot of value that's created when you do that.
Well, you consider yourself an extroverted personality.
I mean, yeah, but I also like a good book and sitting by the fire and reading alone for a time.
Here's the reason I ask, because you just talked about reaching out and going to the groups and speaking. And I was thinking about myself. And it's like, okay, you just mentioned Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I've spent the last 5 years, about 85% of that in Asia. And so the vast majority of my podcast, which was started in 2012, all but 2012 and 2013 those were outside the U.S. So I'm farther away than everybody. And I think I've kind of got almost the introverted perspective about it, where I'm able to kind of build this network stuff, and I'm able to do it a little bit without being there in person. So I'm just kind of contrasting. If people are listening and they're saying, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do the in-person stuff all the time. I think it's more of the philosophy and the idea that you're going to go down this network thinking path, and then perhaps how you execute it. There can be different ways.
No, you're exactly right. So, I mean, I have to tell you, this didn't start, I didn't start out flying around the country, traveling to all of these events. I actually started similar as you. I've been a podcaster for about 8 years now. I must have a much less frequent production schedule than you, because I'm thinking I've got like 200 episodes in.
I've got problems.
The goal of it when I started was twofold. One was to sort of build an audience, build a platform. I wanted to write, I wanted to travel and speak and do all of that sort of stuff. But the other was the realization that I needed a network, and I couldn't just hang out in New York City for a year and try and meet everyone there. And so the podcast did a couple things. It gave me an excuse to reach out cold to people like you've been talking about, you've done with yours for a long time. It also gave me the opportunity to invite people in to a shared activity. We're going to create this piece of content. It's not like, it's a totally different thing, I find, than saying, oh, can we just chat? Can we get coffee? Which is, you always pitch it as like, can we have 15 minutes for coffee? But let's be honest, it's like a 2-hour long commitment, because you got to travel to the place, you got to do the whatever. This is, let's jump on Skype and talk for 30 minutes, right? Or let's talk for an hour. The interesting thing I found is that, I'm sure this happened to you too, is almost every time after you finished the normal interview, that person that you're talking to, whether it's Daniel Kahneman or Daniel Pink, who was actually my first podcast guest ever, right? You end up chatting for 15 or 20 minutes offline after the interview. And it was an incredibly valuable resource for me, because I got to learn how to be the type of career that I wanted to do, right? That I wanted to be, by interacting with these people after the fact. And then again, that connection is a little bit deeper, because you didn't just ask to pick their brain. You didn't just send them a cold email or a LinkedIn request. You invited them in to create something with you. And it doesn't have to be a podcast now. I see people do it with articles. I see people do it with video now, because that's kind of where podcasting was 8 years ago when you and I were just kind of getting our feet wet. There's a bunch of different mediums that you can use to bridge that gap. And you could still even just do the coffee thing, but say, let's not actually meet in person. Let's just jump on Zoom for 15 minutes and chat.
As I'm thinking about this subject, I'm thinking the way you've structured things and friend of a friend. And as I'm giving you these explanations, as I try to think about my network over the last 20 years, I'm having to reassess, because I remember I had a book come out in 2004, my first book. I was a no-name author. It sold really well. By early 2005, I knew it had sold really well. So I reached out to like 15 of the most successful fund managers in the world. And literally within a day, 13 of them responded and said, sure, I'll give you an informational interview. I was working on a second book. I then just, on my dime, flew around the world for, several months, just talking with all these people, these really interesting, influential people. And so, and you mentioned this in your work, so this is why I'm trying to expand this perspective for me. But I laid the foundation by going and actually sitting down and breaking bread and going to people's homes and their offices and becoming friends in many times, and longstanding relationships that have lasted for sometimes, well over 15 years. There is that foundation in my world where I built that, and then these other things that start to occur as podcasting gets more popular and stuff. And you talk about this in your book, that sometimes the quote, rich get richer. You build something, and then perhaps a decade later, it can kind of morph into something else. So I just wanted to kind of take that back a little bit for a second, that I was positioning myself as this introverted podcaster who was not meeting people in person. I've spent a lot of time in person, so I just want to, at least correct myself.
Yeah, no, totally. But the point is, it can work the other way too, right? So I would call myself an ambivert. I'm sort of towards the middle. I don't really like to go to the big parties, but I do like interacting with people face to face. But I went the opposite way, just out of necessity. So I started with a much more low risk, let's connect, let's record this sort of podcast episode, which is essentially like, let's have a phone call. And now, the list of previous podcast guests for me, or other friends that I've met through growing my career as a writer speaker, those are the people that I'm reaching out to when I'm in that new city. So, a great example, because I mentioned him earlier, he was the first podcast guest. The last time I was in Washington, D.C. last summer, brought the whole family over and mentioned that to Danny. He was like, oh, you should come over. And so I went over. They went sort of sightseeing, and I went over and hung out at his house for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, just sort of spitballing different ideas around what it means to be a writer in 2018 and book marketing and all of this kind of stuff. So this deeper sort of in-person conversation, that happened after the fact. And that's the thing I think is interesting. Your story and mine might be even reversed, but the principles are the same, which means it can work whichever way you play it.
Let's take this apart in a different way. You go in so many different interesting directions in your work, and we're not going to cover everything in this conversation, but there are some people out there, and I think there's a great example in Hollywood that you have written about, and I would like for you to explain it, because his story of how he would actually get to meet the influential network node themselves and got past the gatekeepers, quite fascinating. I would love for you to, in brief, to explain the story of Brian Grazer.
Brian Grazer is fascinating as a whole. So I have the weirdest thing, because I sort of backtracked. He first came on my radar because he was involved, Imagine Entertainment was involved in the creation of the TV show 24, which was one of my favorite TV shows probably ever, right? But it turns out, I mean, he started with Splash, which was a famous Tom Hanks film, and has had a hand in a bunch of different really notable films over the last 20 years and television shows, et cetera. And it all actually started, he was a law student and was looking for a summer job. And it turned out like he overheard, this is the weirdest thing, it wasn't even a friend of a friend connection. He heard someone yelling outside of his like apartment window about this super cush job that he just quit because it was so boring, working at a movie studio as a legal aid. And so he calls up. I mean, this is actually pretty, we can call it extroverted. I would just call it like super brave. He calls up the studio and he says, here's who I am. I understand you're looking for a legal analyst. I'm a first year or second year law student, et cetera. And then they're like, all right, great. Can you come to the studio tomorrow at 3 for an interview? And at like 3:15, he has the job. Now, it turns out that all he is he's a glorified courier. All his job is to push papers around to different people in the studio. But eventually, as he's doing this job, he's realizing that, wait a minute, I'm actually like, I think there's one instance he talks about delivering Warren Beatty's contract when he's at the Beverly Hills Hotel, right? And he's like, I'm actually traveling around the really sort of high-powered network of Hollywood. I should really take advantage of this. And so he starts in a little sort of testing the waters move. He starts saying that no, I can't just give it to the secretary. I have to, because it's a legal document. I have to deliver it in person. And no one pushes back on that. So they just let him through. And here, go talk to Warren and hand him his thing. And so he starts to meet those people. And like I was saying earlier with the podcast thing, you get a 5 or 10 minute conversation out of it. But a lot of times when you're just new, fresh faced in there, those are full of advice or even just sort of the realization that you can do this that are incredibly valuable to an aspiring producer, right? And he takes it a little bit step further and he realizes, I work in the legal department of Warner Brothers, one of the most powerful studios ever. And he starts pushing for, he's like, early 20s and he's pushing for coffee meetings with a lot of people. So what he would do is he would call up and he'd say, my name is Brian Grazer. I work in Warner Brothers Legal Affairs. This isn't about studio business, but I would love the opportunity to talk to so-and-so, and here's why. And most of the time, just the fact that he's from that studio and he's working in the legal department gets him past the gatekeepers, and he ends up getting these meetings with high-powered individuals who he just shows up and asks a bunch of questions. Right now, over time, once he actually sort of had a footing as a producer, he kept that going, and he now still regularly commits to, I think it's 2 a month is his goal, what he calls curiosity conversations. And they're very much just, I'm really interested in learning more about this part of the world, this subject matter, this industry, et cetera. Who can I talk to? And some of it he works through his network to get introductions, and other times it's just like that. It's cold, but it's who do I need to talk to in that industry so that I can learn more about it. Over time, the other thing that happens when you do that is, we were talking earlier about structural holes. If you're trying to learn different things about lots of different industries, you're bridging a lot of structural holes and making your network really, really vast. And that pays dividends when it comes time to make a movie about that industry or do some other project where you need to know a couple people in that field.
Curiosity Conversations. That'd be a great podcast title, huh?
Oh, totally. But I'm betting, since he used to work in legal affairs, that he already owns a trademark to it. So I'm not going to fight him in court on that one.
Hey, a point that you make in your work, which I think is just kind of a basic type point, but it's even though it's basic, I don't think we think of it in these terms. Our connections are, they matter, but so does, number one, how do we know them? Number 2, why do we know them? Number 3, where you met. Number 4, who else they know. That starts to get more right back at the network theory. And it's, again, how do you know them? Why do you know? Where you met? Who else do they know? And that number 4 is really tricky because I think about, even though I've got this interesting network that's expanded in the last 5 or 6 years, I've not gone down the path of who they know as much as I could. I mean, I like to sleep, so I guess that's part of the problem. But I can't do this 24/7. But I think it really gets to the larger issue that, let's say you're kind of hinting at this with young people in particular. But if you're 20 years old and you are willing to go push, and you got a little moxie, and you kind of can pick up how the game's played, you literally have no excuses for who you can meet. I mean, you can meet anybody.
Exactly right. In 2018, there's a myriad of ways to get connected to just about anybody. And, one of the things that I actually, because you're right, I think most people don't think about that who they know portion. Again, if your mental model is that your network is a list of contacts, a list of people you know, then you're not thinking about the hidden aspects of the network. You're not thinking about the network structure itself. So one of the things that I encourage a lot of people to do, and this is not asking for an introduction. That might come down the road, it might not. But in the course of regular conversations, especially with people who don't exactly do the same thing as you or don't live in the same part of the world, is I like to ask the question, hey, who do you know in blank? With blank being whatever it is, right? So literally a couple weeks ago, the question that yielded a lot of potential was, hey, who do you know that works in television, like has ever produced a television show or works for a network, et cetera? And the reason for that, I'm not asking for an introduction, I'm just trying to sort of get a sense, is that I'm drawing a rough sort of map of my 1 or 2 degree of separation out network. And I've met a couple people that have either produced a television show or used to turns out that I have a friend who, by asking that, it actually wasn't a 1 degree of separation connection. It was him. Turned out he used to work on Sesame Street, which I think is awesome. You ask that question because it's a low risk way to get a sense of where your network is leading 1 or 2 degrees of separation out. And again, you're not asking for an introduction because over time, as your friends your closer connections start to realize that you're asking that question out of curiosity, not out of utility. I think this is where a lot of networking goes wrong. You're just asking it out of curiosity. You get more sort of open answers. The other thing it does is it sort of allows people to pro-offer an introduction. So most of us, this is one of the features of like a LinkedIn that I hate. If you can see who's 1 degree of separation out, there's even a function where you can ask for an introduction. The problem is everybody uses LinkedIn differently, right? I now know I should never ask for an introduction for you on LinkedIn because you accept every request. So you might not actually have a relationship with that person you're connected to. The other thing, though, even if it's real life, it really puts the other person in a weird spot when you ask for an introduction, because now they basically have to think like, can I vouch for this person or not? Can I like you asked for an introduction to someone? Can I vouch for you? Or am I going to embarrass myself by introducing you to that person? When you ask who you know in blank, you give them the opportunity, if they know multiple people, to pick the one that's the best connection and then to let them sort of opt in or offer to make that introduction. Most of the time I do it because I'm not interested in an introduction. I'm just interested, period, full stop. And then as a result, I've got a sense of who, if I ever decide I wanted to make a TV show, I've got a list of 4 or 5 people that now I could go ask for an introduction to, if I wanted that, because I asked it in sort of this no-risk manner and let them pro-offer the person who'd be the best fit for me.
The way I do the asking for guests for this show, I have several nodes that have wider nodes than me or wider networks than me. And so I will, maybe one particular voice, I will reach out to every 3 or 4 months and say, hey, who do you think I should be talking to? Which is the reason you and I are talking right now. The other way I'll also do it is I will reach out to people that I have no connection with at all. And I reached out to a gentleman recently named Oliver Hart, and he won the 2016 Nobel Prize in Economics. I had no connection to him, but I sent him an email that said, hey, I'd like to interview you. Here's my podcast. And I gave him a list of like 10 names. Here are 10 prior guests, peers of yours. 5 of them were Nobel Prize winners. So the assumption in my mind was he probably, even though I didn't know that he knew them, he probably knew them and was probably close personal friends with some of them, which probably led to doing the interview. So it's kind of a hack that you can kind of, even if you don't necessarily know all the people that are known by the people that you know, if you think about it, you can kind of piece it together.
Oh, totally. Or, I mean, I know of a lot of folks that literally will just, after interviewing a guest on the podcast, their final question offline to the guest is, hey, now you've been on the show, it was a great episode, who do you think would be a good fit for the show? And then you find out about maybe author friends who have an upcoming book that wasn't on your radar yet, or you find out about who's about to win the Nobel. I'm just kidding. I don't know how they would know who's about to win the Nobel Prize, but you find out, you end up meeting really interesting people because they're offering them. And it's not, can you connect me to this person? It's, here's a list, or it's who do you know in, and then you let them offer it. And it takes you in directions that you would have never expected, but I guarantee you enjoy.
It kind of leads me to a term that, and maybe this is exactly what you're saying, but this, the phrase you use in your work, preferential attachment.
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting one. One of the interesting things about networks, and actually there's a study that just came out that's now debating this well-established rule. I think we're going to find inside the well-established rule, so it's all fine. But it's funny to me, science is never settled, right? There's still people challenging network science on this. But the term in network science is actually scale-free. In other words, that there is a potentially unlimited, or there's unlimited potential for new connections to any given node, right? So over time, what that creates is it's not that people have an average that they're connected to. I mean, maybe you've heard that number 150, that, we have 150 close friends, et cetera, that's sort of the average, but that's not an average the way most people think about it, where they think about a bell curve, a normative distribution, and there's some more, some little, but it all tends to cluster around 150. It's actually the opposite. It's actually a power law. This is much more the 80-20 principle, or the Pareto principle, the idea that there's some that have a ton, and then it sort of tails off in this long tail as it goes down. Now, the interesting thing to me about this is not just that, some people have all the connections like Brian Grazier and other people don't. It's that as you work hard to start to build your network, preferential attachment takes over and people start to come to you. So the more connections that you have, the more friends that you have, the more likely as a new person enters the network that you're going to get connected to them, because the more friends you have, the more potential for introductions to new people they have. The real lesson for most people on this, most people are already not at the top of the curve of this 80-20 with thousands and thousands of connections. Most people are working hard to build and grow their network. The good news is that it gets easier over time. And eventually you might find yourself in the position where you actually have to start pruning your network because you're getting so many of these potential introductions. But it's sort of like a snowball effect. It gathers steam as it goes down, or it gathers snow as it goes down. Steam would mean the snowball melts, so that's a terrible analogy. It gets easier over time, and that's really good news, because it means that you might have to push really hard for a few years. You might have to do like and jump on planes and travel all over the world for a few years, but eventually it just kind of your network building just kind of takes over for itself, and it just keeps growing, and all you have to do is sort of be along for the ride.
I'll give another personal example of this, and I just mentioned right throughout this conversation, I've talked about some Nobel Prize winners that have come on this podcast. And look, I'm no dummy. I mean, if I have had now 6 Nobel Prize winners in economics appear on this show, it's much easier for me to get number 7 than it is for the guy that has 0 to get 1.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's what I actually was about to, just before you mentioned it, I was about to make a joke that like you really have a thing for Nobel Prize winners, but it's not. It's
of course.
It's I mean, maybe you have an interest in it, but it's also preferential attachment, that it gets way, way easier to build those connections because you've already got a few in your pocket.
You make a great point, though. I don't know if I've got a thing for it, but I kind of look at it like, okay, I didn't do very good in econ in college. I was a political science major, that if I've got the opportunity now in my life to keep going back to school every, 3 months or 6 months or whatever, when somebody comes on the radar screen that might make a great guest, yeah, I think it's absolutely one of the coolest things in the world to see. My gosh, 4 or 5 years from now, can I get that number up to 20? Why not, right?
No, exactly. Absolutely. And again, it gets easier. Getting 6 was way harder than getting 20. I wish I had any sort of empathy for you. I didn't even take econ in college. I was an undergrad English major. And then when I went to grad school, I studied industrial organizational psychology. And so the thing to me I always see is the IO psychologist winning the Nobel Prizes in economics, because behavioral economics is really just psych. So I've got like a chip on my shoulder. And you do too. It's just a different chip.
Hey, let's talk about something slightly different, but in the same headspace. I love the example, and it's also he's a big Pareto principle guy too, but I love the example of how Tim Ferriss, and I've heard Tim talk about this personally, but I love the example of him surveying the landscape and saying, gosh, how do I tackle this landscape where I am and reach? And then how do I use, because he was a no-name guy at the time. So Tim's got this idea for the 4-hour work week and says, how do I reach this kind of target audience of male techie types, kind of like me? How do I reach them? And he had a very novel, straightforward approach in hindsight that not a lot of people are executing on.
Tim is an unknowing network scientist. So inside of network science, there's this fascinating, it's a relatively new discovery referred to as the majority illusion. And basically what it says is that you don't have to be popular inside a cluster in a network. If you're connected to the most connected people, then you will appear more popular than you really are. And I think this is to me, this explains all sorts of things that's whenever it seems like it's a fad and then you really dig into it and you're like, no, actually, no, not everyone. It's just these 4 people are ranting and raving about this thing. So what Tim did was Tim knew, this is someone who had built a very passive business, right? He built an online marketing company selling supplements that he basically built without being the public face of it because he didn't want to be the public face. He just wanted it to be this sort of passive income machine. And now he has to build a brand of Tim Ferriss and be a public face of something. So he's figuring out okay, how can I use these sort of similar principles? And he gets this idea that, okay, who do I care about? Well, for the first 6 months of this book, the people that I care about reaching with the message are not everyone, not mass market, but is the cluster of 18 to 29-year-old tech-savvy males. He goes, all right, well, given that I'm going after 18 to 29 tech-savvy males, who are the 15 or 20 blogs, podcasting was kind of new at the time, but includes podcasts, websites, et cetera. Where are these people getting their news? And then he makes a deliberate effort, actually not unlike you, flies off to tech conferences, and his goal is no pressure, no sales pitch, just to meet the people who write for those sites, who host those shows, etc., just to build a relationship with the most connected people in the cluster of 18 to 29-year-old tech-savvy males. And then when the book comes, if they ask him what he does, he might say, well, I just wrote this book and blah, blah, blah. Would you love a copy? But as we get closer, then he starts pitching, do you want a copy of this book? And he gets himself on basically all of those websites. The thing that's amazing is, again, mass media wise, no one paid attention. It's hard to think about now knowing how many millions of copies 4-Hour Workweek has sold. But there was a time when if you were not an 18 to 29-year-old tech-savvy male, you would have never heard of this book. And yet everyone inside that cluster had heard of it. I remember, it's still somewhere. I have a first edition of that book because I was in that crew at the time. And the interesting thing is then that cluster sort of goes to work for you and it spreads throughout. But there really was a time where Tim Ferriss was not famous at all and then still only famous inside that place because he was deliberately targeting the most connected people inside that space. What that allowed him to do was get that sort of critical mass. And what's interesting is this is actually a really savvy marketing thing too. So I've seen this play out in a corporate setting too. Also in that chapter, we talk about how Facebook, to me, the real thing that Facebook did compared to all of the other social networks is they went campus by campus, which made it way easier to get to critical mass, to get to the most connected students on one campus. And suddenly everybody's on that network. If you don't go to that school, then you don't think that it's that popular of a service. Everything else went national right off the bat. They chose to go college campus to college campus, and within weeks they were the most popular site on that college campus. Then they'd go to the next one, and that allowed them to not only sort of control their growth rate, which is why they did it, but also allowed them to seem like, oh, you got to get in on this, because if you're not, you're missing out, even though there was only 10,000 students at a time thinking that.
Facebook is such a fascinating thing to watch it unfold, and I sometimes think to myself, okay, it unfolded that way, but did it unfold that way only for the reasons you described, or because, gosh, MySpace was terrible and they had great timing? I could have seen the same end result of Facebook unfolding in other ways. But I think the way that the network expanded was quite amazing, and quite the tactical approach they took was really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, so I mean, what I'll tell you is that at first they were doing this because they needed to control growth. They were bootstrapping, and so if it suddenly became super popular, it would overload the servers. And that's what a lot of the MySpaces of the world would do. They would time out. They would have, I mean, before Facebook, there was also Friendster, and it was a terrible experience because sometimes you couldn't even log on because the servers were overloaded. So this allowed them to just basically, if we're only opening to campus, that allows us to control it and make sure we always have enough server space for the people that we're serving. Over time, though, they figured out that this is exactly what's happening. And I think the proof of that is that when they wanted to get on Baylor University's campus, Baylor down in Waco, Texas, it's a big school, 20,000 students. But at first, there was already sort of an on-campus, locally run version of Facebook that Baylor was really pushing for. So what they decided to do was open up to every campus within like 75 square miles of Baylor, so that if you think about it, like if you go to Baylor, most people who go to Baylor went to high school somewhere in Texas. And if suddenly all of your high school friends who didn't go to Baylor are on this social network and you're not, well, that creates a strong sort of internal demand. So they played it the same way Tim Ferriss did, and they learned that lesson over time. Again, like I said, it started out because they were trying to control growth and the number of servers they needed. But it's Facebook. They study how networks work. So they pretty quickly figured out what was going on and used it to their advantage.
One practical thought here, or an idea that you proffer in the work: activities, not networking events. Bless you. I don't want to attend networking events and wear that name tag and hold a little plastic cup of something somewhere in a Holiday Inn. I don't know where, but I don't want to be there.
Yeah, I think we've all been there, right? We've all been to those events, and you know, there's the ones where the whole purpose is to meet random people, like you said, they're at the Holiday Inn or whatever, and those are super uncomfortable. Slightly more comfortable are those networking hours at conferences, where the point is to kind of meet people. But we've all been there, and what you do is you end up interacting with people you already know, or you end up interacting with people that are kind of already similar to you. But most people really don't push themselves to meet people that are unlike them or in a different area because it's uncomfortable. And the other thing is that because almost any time that you're sort of trying to build your network for the sake of networking, it seems too utilitarian. It seems sleazy. Let's just call it sleazy. In fact, there's actually some studies that show that networking makes people feel literally dirty. It gives them subconscious thoughts of wanting to get clean, right? So I'm not really interested in any activity outside of working out that makes me want to take a shower afterwards, right? Because it's probably not good for me. But it turns out that one of the best ways to grow your network is to do something similar but a little bit different, and that's to seek out what we call in the book shared activities. These are things that the goal is not networking. The goal is to do something else, to create something else, to be a part of something else. And this is everything from sort of a hobby club, like I mentioned working out earlier. Believe it or not, places like CrossFit or My Sports Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are surprisingly good at drawing a diverse set of people that, because you're not focused on meeting them, you're focused on doing this activity, you end up actually building a deeper relationship faster in a weird way. The other thing, it could be volunteering, so being on a nonprofit board, right, or being a part of some extra work club that still happens at work. There's all sorts of things, but almost anything where the goal is to be a part of something else, where it's not to meet people, where there is a stake in it, meaning it could be win or lose, or you could succeed or fail, so there is an inspiration for people to be involved. You end up meeting a more diverse set of people than you would otherwise, and you end up building a deeper connection to them faster than you would have otherwise. And so if you're like you and like me, and all of these events in the Holiday Inn Express just seem odd, you have my permission to skip them for the rest of your life, as long as you replace that time with investing in some shared activity where you can meet a diverse set of connections.
So here's my shared activity I will share with you and the audience. My shared activity is this. I don't really have one, but what's unfolded is what I call the Park Hyatt filter. If people track me down in Asia because of this podcast, and it does happen quite regularly, the Park Hyatt filter is what I like, which is if somebody texts me and they say, hey, I'd like to meet you at the Park Hyatt, See, that works. I can trust that. That's an interesting activity. We're in a foreign country. We can talk about whatever. It's just a filter. It kind of lets you maybe feel a little bit safe that, maybe some crazy person is not out stalking you. And it's actually worked out quite nicely. I've met some super successful individuals that have literally just been listening to the podcast and they're coming through the area or whatnot. That's my podcast activity. That's a little bit different one. I'm not really sure if I call that a club or what, but it's worked all right.
No, Club Hyatt. That works. That works.
And I'm not trying to sound like, kind of like all that or anything. I guess if there was a Holiday Inn close by, I would use that too.
No. It's actually, I've stayed at Holiday Inn Express and I've stayed at a Park Hyatt. I totally understand. I get it. I totally get it. But the point is, again, to be sort of open to that idea. One of the hardest things we do is we put networking in a box, and we think it only happens at these events that we hate going to. We don't think about all of the other activities that we do where we meet people who may or may not be beneficial to us and our network down the road because we're so focused on doing that one event at the time. And that's awesome. It's like growing your network automatically.
Well, and look, again, this is not necessarily something where somebody in the audience is going to say, oh, I can relate to that. But look, I'm in Asia and I get an email and the email says, hey, I'm in your city. I'd like to have coffee or have a beer or whatever. I generally will take that. If it looks normal, and generally it does, why not? Because you just don't know who you're going to meet. You don't have any idea. And usually, especially if you're if you're doing something like I'm doing right now in a different part of the world, you should be able to deduce that they probably are also a like-minded, adventuresome sort. So there's just, you're right. It's the kind of think outside the box. How can you meet interesting people? And don't be closed down to it, because the moment you say, you know what, I don't really feel like, you're not doing anything that night. Oh, I'm just going to sit at home. I'm too lazy to get up and go do this. It's the wasted opportunity to expand the network.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's a lot of times people don't think of it as I'm doing this to grow my network. And that's actually the best way to grow your network is to engage in those things that you don't think of as a networking event. They turn out to work better than the networking mixers.
Yeah, sure. And I don't. I just kind of go because it's like I'm curious. Like, oh, okay, let's why not?
Now we're back at curiosity conversations. I love it.
Yeah, of course, 100%. The book is Friend of a Friend, Understanding the Hidden Networks That Can Transform Your Life. And there's no doubt about it. We've had an hour-long conversation about how these things have transformed both of our lives. And again, I salute you for taking something that perhaps, I just take for granted and I don't really think about strategically or scientifically, and perhaps I need to do a lot better at that. But you've definitely given me a lot of food for thought. So I think the audience will probably find similar aha moments as I have found.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been absolutely great. And you're a great example of somebody who was sort of in line with a lot of these principles anyway. So it's sort of, okay, now I know the science behind why they worked and I know where I can go from here. I'm guessing there'll be a lot of folks too that are like, well, I don't even know where to start. Again, start with understanding the whole network you have around you, and then you'll have a sense of what steps you need to take next. It's far more than just a collection of contacts on your phone.
You make a great point for people. This is a complete side point, but to those entrepreneurs out there that are thinking, what can I do? What can I do? It's as simple as looking at the landscape with an open eye and saying, this thing that we do every day, this thing that we know, this way that we operate, no one's codified it. So you're doing a great job of codifying the network amongst us human beings in a way that is novel, and that's to be saluted. We all want to find something novel to do. That's what keeps us energized and going forward every day.
I look at my role as translating or bridging the structural hole between all of these network science people and the people that need the insights from network science. So I give credit back to them, Duncan Watts and Christakis and Fowler and all of those hard to pronounce names that I cited in the book. But you're right. It's amazing how beneficial all of this research is, and it's hiding in plain sight. We just need to have the right mental model for approaching our network and our collection of friends.
David, where can we send people? Where's the best website for them to go check you out?
Obviously, I would love it if they jump on Amazon or their bookseller of choice and check out the book. But the best place is this, actually. I've set up, if you go to davidburkus.com/trend, I have set up a giveaway just for your listeners. I call it an audio course. Think of it like a series of podcasts. It is basically instructions from network science on how to give and get the introductions that you need. And they can download that perfectly, totally free at davidburkus.com/trend. And then from there, I mean, if they like that, you're going to love the book. So check that out as well. But that is yours. No pressure, no nothing. Just enjoy.
David, thank you again. Keep me posted on your future work because I know you will not stop.
Thanks. That's definitely true. That is definitely true. Thank you so much for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.